Hello everyone. In today's video, I bring you a powerful story full of revelations that will leave you speechless. We're going to meet Callista Rivers, a 40-year-old woman who had a life-changing near-death experience. During this moment beyond life, she encountered the Creator and received a shocking revelation about the souls of homosexuals. What she discovered on the other side will challenge everything you've ever heard about spirituality and unconditional love. Before we begin, make sure to give this video a like. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our exciting upcoming videos. Now, get ready for this deep and revealing journey. Hello, my name is Callista Rivers. I'm 40 years old and never imagined I'd be here telling this story. You know when you read or hear about surreal experiences, those that seem to happen only to other people? Well, I used to think that way. I believed those things were reserved for fiction books or sensational documentaries. But life has a strange way of surprising us, doesn't it? I was born and raised in a small town in rural Nevada. My childhood was pretty typical. School, friends, family. I married young to Ethan, my high school sweetheart, and together, we built a quiet life. We have 2 wonderful children, stable jobs, and a comfortable routine. Nothing in my life suggested I would be the protagonist of such an extraordinary story. I've always been a practical person, with my feet on the ground. I believed in what I could see and touch, spirituality. Well, that was something I respected in others but didn't play a part in my daily life. My faith was limited to believing in the goodness of people and the importance of doing good, nothing too deep or transcendental. Our family always loved spending summer vacations at Lake Tahoe. It was our annual tradition, 2 weeks of sun, water, and fun. That summer seemed like any other. We packed our bags, hit the road, and arrived at our destination with the usual excitement. The fresh mountain air, the smell of pine trees, the sight of the crystal-clear lake. It all filled me with a sense of freedom that I couldn't find anywhere else. If someone had told me at that moment that my life was about to change drastically, I probably would have laughed. After all, what could happen? We were in a familiar place, doing activities we had done dozens of times before. But that's the irony of life, isn't it? The biggest changes often happen when we least expect them, in the most ordinary moments. On that sunny afternoon, as we headed out for a boat ride, I had no idea I was about to embark on the most extraordinary journey of my life. A journey that would take me beyond the limits of what I believed possible, challenging everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. This is my story, a story of an accident that almost took my life but paradoxically gave me a new perspective on what it truly means to live. It's a story about crossing boundaries we didn't know existed and coming back to tell the tale. But above all, it's a story about love. A love so vast and unconditional that it transcends our earthly understanding. Prepare yourselves, because what I'm about to share may challenge your beliefs, just as it challenged mine. But I ask you to keep an open mind. After all, if a skeptic like me could experience something so profound, who knows what else might exist beyond the veil of our everyday reality? The day started like any other during our vacation at Lake Tahoe. The sun shone brightly, reflecting off the crystal-clear waters of the lake, creating thousands of little dancing diamonds on the surface. The air was filled with the scent of pine trees and the distant sound of laughter and conversations from other families enjoying the summer. After lunch, my brother-in-law Jeff suggested a boat ride. "Let's try out that new inflatable toy we bought," he said with an enthusiastic smile. Everyone eagerly agreed. I, in particular, was excited to feel the adrenaline rush of being towed by the boat, bouncing over the waves. We all boarded Jeff's boat, me, my sister Sarah, my husband Ethan, and our kids. The engine roared to life, and soon we were cutting through the lake's waters, the wind whipping through our hair, bringing with it a sense of absolute freedom. We laughed and chatted, pointing out the beautiful scenery around us. When we reached a more open area of the lake, Jeff slowed down. "Who wants to go first on the inflatable?" he asked. Without hesitation, I raised my hand. "I will," I exclaimed, feeling like an excited kid. I put on my life jacket and jumped into the warm lake water. I swam over to the large inflatable, a giant disc designed to glide over the water when pulled by the boat. I climbed onto it with some difficulty, laughing at my own clumsiness. Sarah handed me the rope attached to the boat, and I held on tightly. "Are you ready?" Jeff shouted from the boat. I gave a thumbs up, grinning from ear to ear. The boat's engine roared again, and I started to feel the pull, slowly at first, then faster and faster. The sensation was incredible. The wind in my face, water splashing around me, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I was laughing, screaming with joy, when suddenly, something went wrong. I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but one moment I was on the disc, and the next, I felt the rope wrap around my leg. I tried to shout, to warn Jeff to stop the boat, but the sound of the engine and the wind drowned out my voice. Panic set in when I realized I was being pulled off the inflatable. I tried desperately to hold on to something, anything, but it was no use. Within seconds, I was dragged into the water. The impact was brutal. It felt like I had hit a concrete wall. Cold water flooded my lungs as I was pulled under. The pain in my leg was excruciating, but the fear of drowning was even worse. I fought to get back to the surface, but the rope kept pulling me. Each time I managed to emerge for a brief moment, I was dragged under again. My mind was in total panic. Flashes of my life passed before my eyes. My wedding, the birth of my children, the smiling faces of my family. Would I never see them again? The thought was unbearable. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally. I knew I had to get free of the rope, but my movements were becoming slow, heavy. My lungs burned, begging for air. The darkness began to close in around me. The last sound I heard was my sister's muffled scream. "Callista!" she shouted, her voice distorted by the water, and then silence. A deep and absolute silence that seemed to swallow everything. At that moment, I realized I was dying. A strange calm washed over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a surprising acceptance. My last conscious thought was of love for my family, a silent plea for forgiveness for leaving them so soon. And then, everything went dark. What happened next is something that, even years later, still deeply moves me when I try to describe it. One moment I was desperately struggling against the water, feeling my lungs burn and my consciousness fade. The next moment, I experienced a sensation that I can only describe as a sudden, painless separation. It was as if I had passed through an invisible veil, moving from one state to another without any effort or perceptible transition. All the agony, fear, and despair I had felt just seconds before simply vanished. In its place was a profound and absolute peace, a sense of well-being that I had never experienced in my entire life. I realized, with surprising clarity, that I was no longer bound to my physical body. It was as if I was floating above the accident scene, observing everything from a completely new perspective. I saw my body below, submerged in the water, my hair floating around me like a dark halo. I could see the boat not far away. Jeff desperately maneuvering back, Sarah leaning over the side, screaming my name. The strangest part of it all was that this vision caused me no distress. On the contrary, I felt a strange acceptance, as if I were watching a scene from a movie, something distant and not directly connected to me. At that moment, I knew with unshakable certainty that I had left my physical body behind. As I watched the scene below, I began to notice subtle changes around me. The light seemed different, more intense and at the same time softer. The colors of the sky, the water, and the mountains surrounding the lake appeared more vibrant, almost surreal. It was as if I were seeing the world through a filter that revealed a hidden beauty, a deeper reality that we usually cannot perceive. Then, something even more extraordinary began to happen. The familiar scenery of Lake Tahoe started to dissolve around me. The mountains, the lake, the boat, everything began to disappear, as if being erased by an invisible hand. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of fear. Where was I going? What was happening? But that fear was quickly replaced by a sense of expectation. almost excitement. It was as if a part of me, a part I didn't know existed, recognized that something incredible was about to happen. I was being taken somewhere, called by something greater than I could comprehend. As the physical world faded away, I began to move. It wasn't movement as we know it. There was no wind against my face, no sense of speed. It was more as if space itself was moving around me, carrying me to an unknown destination. And then, suddenly, I was there. There wasn't a place in the physical sense of the word. It was a dimension of pure light, a space that felt infinite and yet intimate at the same time. Imagine being at the center of an aurora borealis, with vibrant colors dancing around you in every direction. Deep blues, brilliant greens, intense purples, and shimmering golds moved and flowed, creating patterns of indescribable beauty. There were no sounds in the traditional sense, but I could feel a vibration, a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of reality. It was as if I could hear the music of the spheres, that cosmic harmony described by ancient philosophers. At that moment, I knew I had arrived in a place beyond normal human comprehension, a place where the rules of the physical world no longer applied, a place where I was about to experience something that would forever change my understanding of life, death, and everything in between. And it was in this space of light and harmony that I felt it for the first time. The Creator. The presence that was about to show me truths I had never imagined possible. In that space of light and harmony, something extraordinary began to happen. I felt a presence. It wasn't something I could see with physical eyes or hear with earthly ears. It was a sensation so deep and overwhelming that it permeated every fiber of my being. This presence, which I intuitively recognized as the Creator, had no human form or any other recognizable physical shape. It was more like an energy, a life force so powerful and omnipresent that it filled everything around me and within me. If you've ever felt the warmth of the sun on a summer day, imagine that sensation multiplied by 1,000,000, not just warming your skin, but penetrating every cell of your body, every corner of your consciousness. The most surprising thing of all was the total absence of fear. In life, I had always imagined that an encounter with the divine would be terrifying, that I would feel small and insignificant. But it was nothing like that. On the contrary, and fully accepted. There was no judgment, no condemnation, only total acceptance and a love that transcended anything I could have imagined. In that moment, I understood that this love was the true nature of the universe, that everything that exists, from the smallest subatomic particle to the largest galaxy, is created and sustained by this infinite love. It was a revelation so profound that it felt as if every certainty I had ever had about reality was being gently deconstructed and rebuilt. Then, something even more extraordinary happened. I began to understand things without any words being spoken. It was a form of communication that went beyond language, beyond thoughts as we know them. It was as if each concept, each idea, was transmitted directly to my consciousness without the need for words or images. Through this silent communication, I knew with absolute certainty that I was in the presence of the Creator of the universe, not the anthropomorphic God of any specific religion, but the primordial source of all existence, the infinite intelligence behind all creation. And then came the most profound revelation of all. I realized that it wasn't just me who was enveloped by this unconditional love. Around me, I began to perceive other presences. They weren't physical forms, but consciousnesses, souls like mine. Some I instinctively recognized. They were people who had lived on Earth. Some I had known. Others were strangers to me. What surprised me was realizing that among these souls were people who, during their earthly lives, had been discriminated against, marginalized, judged for their choices or for who they were. I saw the souls of people who had been homosexual, transgender, of different races and cultures, and the truth was revealed to me with crystal clarity. In the spiritual realm, these earthly distinctions have absolutely no relevance. Each soul was seen and loved equally by the Creator. It didn't matter who they had been or what they had done on Earth. It didn't matter their sexual orientation, gender identity, race, or creed. All that mattered was love. A love that transcended any earthly label or identity. This revelation hit me like a wave, dissolving years of prejudices and limiting beliefs that I hadn't even realized I carried. I realized that many of the things we consider important on Earth, status, wealth, physical appearance, even some of our most deeply held convictions, are insignificant in the face of this greater truth. In that moment, I felt a deep connection with all these souls, a sense of unity that went beyond anything I had ever experienced. We were all part of something greater, all equally loved, all equally important in the grand design of the universe. And it was in this state of expanded understanding, of unconditional love, that the Creator asked me a question, not in words, but in a clear feeling that penetrated my consciousness. What would you like to do now? Faced with that question, what would you like to do now? I felt completely paralyzed. How could I, a mere mortal, make a decision of such magnitude? On one hand, I was wrapped in this unconditional love, in this peace that transcended anything I had ever experienced. The idea of leaving it behind seemed almost unbearable. On the other hand, flashes of my earthly life began to pass through my mind. The smiling faces of my children, the gentle touch of my husband, the moments shared with family and friends. In that instant, I realized that I wasn't really being asked to make a choice. The Creator already knew what my decision would be. The question was more of an invitation to reflect, an opportunity for me to deeply understand what truly mattered to me. Not knowing how to respond to something so profound, I simply let the answer come from deep within my being. I trust you, was all I could transmit. And somehow, I knew it was the right answer. It wasn't a choice between staying or returning, but an acceptance of the greater plan, an absolute trust in the wisdom of the Creator. Before departing, I heard a soft, comforting voice, like a whisper reverberating through my being. Good answer. These weren't words in the traditional sense, but direct communication with my soul. In that moment, I felt a wave of love and approval so intense that I almost disintegrated into it. And then, with the same gentleness that had transported me to that dimension of light, I began to feel a shift. The light began to dim. The vibrant colors began to fade. I felt as if I were being gently pulled back, like a feather softly floating down to the ground. As I returned, I began to feel the limitations of the physical world again. The lightness and expansion I had experienced began to give way to a sense of weight, of density. I felt the boundary between the spiritual and the physical closing behind me, like a veil being lowered. Suddenly, the physical reality hit me with full force. I felt the density of flesh again, the weight of my wet body. The throbbing pain in my leg returned, brutally reminding me of the accident. My lungs burned, desperate for air. I opened my eyes, and the first thing I saw was my sister Sarah's face, blurred and distorted by the water. Her hands were gripping my shoulders, pulling me to the surface. When my head finally emerged, I was greeted by a cacophony of sounds, shouts, the boat's engine, the sound of water churning around us. I coughed violently, expelling water from my lungs. The air had never tasted so sweet, so precious. Every breath was a struggle, but also a victory. I was alive. I had returned. As I was lifted onto the boat, I looked around, seeing everything with new eyes. The blue sky, the distant mountains, even the pain I felt. Everything seemed extraordinarily vivid, almost surreal. It was as if I were seeing the world for the first time, aware of every detail, every sensation. My husband Ethan wrapped his arms around me, sobbing with relief. We thought we had lost you," he whispered through tears. I wanted to tell him that everything was okay, that I had experienced something beyond comprehension, but the words escaped me. How could I explain the inexplicable? The rescue and the following moments passed in a blur. I vaguely remember being rushed to the hospital, doctors and nurses moving around me, machines beeping. But all of that seemed distant, almost unreal compared to what I had just experienced. The doctors later told me that I had been submerged for almost 5 minutes, that it was a miracle I was alive, and even more so that I hadn't suffered brain damage. They spoke about the severity of the injuries to my leg, about the long recovery I had ahead. But as they talked about limitations and challenges, I could only think of the vastness of the love I had experienced, of the revelation that we are all equal in the eyes of the Creator. I knew my life would never be the same. The challenge now would be to live with that knowledge, to integrate this transcendental experience into my everyday existence. As I lay in that hospital bed, exhausted but profoundly transformed, I understood that my true journey was just beginning. The months that followed my accident were, without a doubt, the most challenging and transformative of my life. Physically, I was a mess. The doctors had done an excellent job saving my leg, but the road to recovery would be long and painful. Endless hours of physical therapy, exhausting exercises, and sleepless nights due to the pain became my new routine. Every step I took, every movement I made, was a constant reminder of how fragile our physical existence is. There were days when frustration consumed me, when I wondered if I would ever walk normally again. But strangely, this physical pain, this daily struggle, seemed almost insignificant compared to the deep inner transformation I was undergoing. My mind and spirit were in constant turmoil. How could I simply return to my normal life after what I had experienced? How could I look at the world the same way, knowing what I now knew? Everyday reality seemed, in some way, less real than that dimension of light and love I had encountered. I began to see beauty and meaning in things I had previously overlooked. The smile of a nurse, the sound of rain on the hospital window, even the pain I felt, everything seemed imbued with deeper significance. It was as if I had gained a new pair of eyes, capable of seeing beyond the surface of things. At the same time, many of the worries and ambitions that had previously driven me now seemed trivial, almost childish. Issues of status, appearance, material success, all of that had lost its power over me. What really mattered now was love, compassion, connection with others, and with something greater than ourselves. This shift in perspective didn't go unnoticed by those around me. My husband Ethan was the first to notice. "You're different," he told me one day, a mixture of admiration and concern in his eyes. "It's like you've matured in some way." I smiled, knowing there were no words to fully explain what had changed in me. My family and friends also noticed the change. Some found it inspiring, others a bit unsettling. I would listen to them talk about their lives, their problems and concerns, and while I still cared deeply, I realized I could no longer engage in the same way in petty dramas and conflicts. My perspective had expanded in a way that made many of the daily problems seem almost irrelevant. One of the most profound changes was in my attitude toward death. The fear of death, which had always lingered in the back of my mind like a constant shadow, had completely vanished. I now knew, with unshakable certainty, that death was not the end but merely a transition. This understanding brought a peace and freedom I had never known before. My spirituality, which had previously been almost non-existent, blossomed in unexpected ways. I didn't turn to any organized religion. None seemed capable of fully capturing what I had experienced. Instead, I developed my own spiritual practice, based on meditation and direct connection with that source of unconditional love I had encountered. I began voraciously reading about near-death experiences, quantum physics, and spiritual philosophies from various cultures. I found echoes of my experience in mystical traditions from around the world, which only reinforced my conviction that I had touched on something universal, something fundamental to the very nature of reality. As my body healed, I felt an increasingly strong calling to share my experience with others, not to convert or convince, but to offer hope and a different perspective to those who were open to it. I started writing, speaking in small groups, offering comfort to people who were going through their own struggles. But not everything was easy. There were days when I felt torn between two worlds, the spiritual world I had glimpsed and the physical world to which I had returned. The intensity of the love and connection I had experienced made the everyday world seem cold and isolated by comparison. In those moments, I longed for that sense of unity, that certainty of being completely loved and accepted. However, little by little, every instant of appreciation for the beauty of the world around me, all of this was a way to honor and manifest what I had learned. As my physical recovery progressed, I felt that I was also progressing spiritually. Every step I took was not just a triumph over my physical injury, but also a step toward a deeper understanding of my place in the universe and the true purpose of my life. Looking back, I realized that my physical recovery and my spiritual transformation were intrinsically linked. My body was healing, yes, but more than that, I was becoming a completely new person, or perhaps more precisely, I was becoming who I was always meant to be. As the months passed and I continued to process my near-death experience, it became increasingly clear that my relationships and worldview had been deeply altered. It was as if I were seeing everything through a new lens, one that revealed connections and meanings I had previously overlooked. My relationship with my husband, Ethan, was the first to feel the impact of this change. Ethan had always been my safe harbor, my companion through everything. But now I saw something more in him, a timeless soul, as precious and loved by the universe as my own. This new perspective brought a depth to our love that I had never imagined possible. However, it also brought challenges. There were moments when I felt distant, lost in thoughts and feelings that Ethan couldn't fully understand. "It's like part of you is still there," he told me once, a mixture of frustration and concern in his voice. I understood what he meant. Part of me really was there, in that dimension of light and love I had experienced. We had to learn to navigate this new dynamic together. Long and deep conversations became part of our daily routine. I shared with him everything I could about my experience, and although he didn't always fully understand, his effort to try and support my journey strengthened our bond in ways I could never have anticipated. My children were also affected by my transformation. At first, they were simply relieved that I had survived the accident. But as time went on, they began to notice the changes in me. My new perspective on life and death fascinated them, and sometimes it scared them a little. I remember one night when my youngest daughter, Emily, came to me with tears in her eyes. "Mom," she said, "aren't you afraid of dying anymore?" The question caught me by surprise, but I answered honestly. I explained to her that no, I was no longer afraid of death because I had learned that death is not the end, but a transition. I saw the relief in her eyes, mixed with a curiosity that reminded me that these conversations were planting seeds of a deeper understanding of life within her. My relationships with friends and coworkers also went through significant changes. Some friendships deepened, while others grew distant. My new perspective brought both benefits and challenges. On one hand, I was more focused, better able to remain calm in stressful situations, and more empathetic toward my colleagues and clients. On the other hand, some of the goals and ambitions that had once motivated me now seemed hollow and meaningless. I had to reevaluate my career and find ways to align my work with my new values and understanding of life. My worldview as a whole underwent a radical transformation. Before the accident, I saw the world in fairly concrete and materialistic terms. I believed in what I could see, touch, and measure. Now, I saw layers of reality that had previously been hidden from me. I began to see interconnections in everything, the separation I had once perceived between people, between humanity and nature, between the physical and the spiritual. All of it began to dissolve. I saw the world as an intricate web of relationships, where every action, every thought, had an impact on the whole. This new worldview brought with it a sense of responsibility. If we are all connected, then each of our actions matters more than we ever imagined. I began paying more attention to my daily choices, the words I used, how I treated others, even the products I bought. Everything seemed to carry a moral weight that I had never considered before. My attitude toward nature and the environment also changed drastically. I had always liked nature, but now I saw it as something sacred, alive, and conscious. I began to feel a deep connection with trees, animals, even the stones and the soil beneath my feet. This shift in perspective led me to adopt a more sustainable lifestyle and to get involved in environmental causes. Perhaps the most profound change was in my understanding of human diversity. I vividly remembered how, during my experience, I saw that all souls were equally loved and valued, regardless of who they had been on earth. This translated into an unconditional acceptance and love for all people, regardless of their race, gender, sexual orientation, or beliefs. I began to see beauty in human diversity in a way I had never seen before. Each person I met was a unique universe, an individual expression of the divine love I had experienced. This led me to actively seek out new perspectives, to listen to stories different from my own, and to advocate for equality and justice with renewed passion. However, this new worldview also brought challenges. Sometimes I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I had learned. How could I live a normal life knowing what I knew? How could I balance the awareness of the eternal with the demands of everyday life? I learned that the answer lay in integration. It wasn't about denying my earthly experience in favor of the spiritual, nor about ignoring the spiritual to focus solely on the physical. The challenge, and the beauty, was in finding ways to bring that light, that unconditional love I had experienced, into every aspect of my daily life. This journey of integration, of living between two worlds, became the central focus of my life. Each day brought new discoveries, new challenges, and new opportunities for growth. And though it wasn't always easy, I knew deep in my being that I was on the right path, the path home. As months turned into years after my near-death experience, I felt an increasingly strong call to share what I had experienced. At first, I hesitated. How could I translate something so profound, so beyond common human experience, into words? How could I talk about it without sounding crazy or presumptuous? I started slowly, sharing parts of my experience with close friends and family members who showed genuine interest. Their reactions varied from fascination to skepticism, but what surprised me was how these conversations seemed to touch something deep in people, regardless of their personal beliefs. One day, during a follow-up appointment, my physical therapist, Dr. Miranda Hayes, asked me what gave me the strength to continue with the arduous recovery. Without thinking too much, I began talking about my experience. To my surprise, she listened attentively, without judgment. At the end of the session, with tears in her eyes, she thanked me. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear that today," she said. It was at that moment that I realized my story could be more than just mine. It could be a source of comfort, hope, and inspiration for others. I decided it was time to share my experience more broadly. I started by writing a blog. At first, it was just personal reflections on my recovery journey, with occasional mentions of my near-death experience. But as I gained confidence, I began to write more openly about what I had experienced. The sensation of leaving my body, the encounter with the Creator, the revelations about unconditional love and the nature of reality. To my surprise, the blog quickly gained followers. I began receiving emails from people across the country, and even from other countries, sharing their own experiences or expressing how my story had touched their lives. There were skeptics, of course, some even hostile, but I learned not to let that affect me. I knew my experience was real, and I didn't need to convince anyone. One day, I received an invitation to speak at a small support group for people who had gone through traumatic experiences. I was nervous, but I accepted. Speaking to a group was very different from writing a blog. Seeing people's faces, feeling their emotions as I shared my story, was a powerful and moving experience. After that first talk, opportunities began to arise more frequently. I was invited to speak at churches, holistic centers, and even a medical conference on palliative care. Every time I shared my story, I felt that I was fulfilling a greater purpose, One of the most memorable experiences was when I was invited to speak at a hospital for a group of nurses and doctors who worked in the ICU. I talked about how my experience had changed my view of life and death, about the importance of human touch and compassion, even, or especially, when a patient is unconscious or on the brink of death. After the talk, an elderly doctor came to speak with me, with tears in his eyes. He told me he had spent decades trying to save lives, always seeing death as an enemy to be defeated. My story made him rethink his approach, helping him see that even when we cannot save a life, we can still offer comfort and dignity in the transition. As my story spread, I began receiving invitations for interviews on radio programs and even on some local television shows. Every time I shared my experience, I felt like I was breaking down some of the taboos that exist in our society around death and spirituality. However, not everything was easy. There were difficult moments, times when I felt exposed and vulnerable. Some people tried to use my story to promote their own religious or ideological agendas. Others accused me of seeking attention or being a fraud. I learned to develop thicker skin, to stay true to my truth without letting myself be affected by others' opinions. One of the most rewarding things has been seeing how my story inspired others to share their own experiences. I received countless letters and emails from people who had gone through similar experiences, but had never felt safe to talk about them. Many told me that hearing my story gave them the courage to open up to their families and friends. Over time, I realized that sharing my experience wasn't just about telling an extraordinary story. It was about opening a space for deeper conversations about life, death, purpose, and meaning. It was about challenging people to question their assumptions about reality and consider possibilities beyond what our five senses can perceive. I began to see my role not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who can ask important questions. Questions about what truly matters in life, about how we can live in a way that honors the interconnectedness of all things, about how we can bring more love and compassion into the world. As I continued to share my story, I felt that I was growing and evolving alongside my audience. Every conversation, every talk, every email I responded to helped me understand my own experience more deeply. It was as if, by sharing, I was constantly rediscovering and reinterpreting what I had gone through. Looking back, I realized that sharing my experience became an integral part of my own healing and growth. It wasn't just about helping others, though that was incredibly rewarding. It was also about continuing my own journey of understanding and integration. Every time I tell my story, every time I see the light of recognition in someone's eyes, every time I receive a grateful hug after a talk, I feel that I am honoring the gift that was given to me. I feel that I am fulfilling the silent promise I made in that moment of transition when I chose to trust and return. And so, I continue sharing, continue learning, continue growing. My near-death experience may have lasted only a few minutes in earthly time, but its reverberations continue to spread, touching lives in ways I could never have imagined. Although my near-death experience was deeply transformative and inspiring, the path that followed was not without challenges and doubts. There were times when I felt lost, confused, and even scared by the changes happening in my life and in my perception of reality. One of the earliest and most persistent challenges was the difficulty of translating my experience into everyday language and understanding. How do you explain something that transcends words? How do you describe colors that don't exist in our visible spectrum, or sensations that have no equivalent in our earthly experience? Many times, I felt frustrated by the inadequacy of words to capture the essence of what I had experienced. This communication difficulty sometimes created a sense of isolation. Despite the support of my family and many friends, there were moments when I felt deeply alone. It was as if I had visited a distant and wonderful country, but couldn't fully share its wonders with those who had never been there. Another significant challenge was dealing with skepticism and sometimes outright hostility from some people. While many received my story with interest and openness, others reacted with disbelief or even anger. I was accused of seeking attention, of suffering from some kind of delusion induced by lack of oxygen, or of deliberately deceiving people. These negative reactions, though painful, forced me to question and examine my own experience more deeply. Was I really interpreting what had happened correctly? Could my mind have created the entire experience as a way to cope with the trauma of the accident? I spent sleepless nights replaying every detail of my experience, searching for inconsistencies or flaws that might indicate it was all an elaborate construction of my mind. But the more I examined it, the more convinced I became of the reality and depth of what I had gone through. However, this inner certainty didn't always translate into external confidence. There were moments when I hesitated to share my story, fearing judgment or ridicule. I learned to be selective about with whom and when I shared, which sometimes made me feel like I was living a double life, a public version of myself that kept things normal, and a private version that carried this extraordinary experience. One of the most unexpected challenges came in the form of an existential crisis. Paradoxically, having experienced something so profound and transcendent sometimes made everyday life seem meaningless in comparison. There were days when I asked myself, what is the purpose of all this? Why am I here, dealing with bills, traffic, and small annoyances when I have experienced something so vast and eternal? This feeling of disconnection from the material world sometimes manifested as a kind of cosmic homesickness. I longed for that sense of unity and unconditional love that I had experienced. The physical reality, with all its limitations and imperfections, sometimes felt like a prison in comparison. Another source of doubt and internal conflict came from my attempt to reconcile my experience with my previous beliefs, or lack thereof. Before the accident, I considered myself a fairly skeptical and non-religious person. Now I found myself struggling to integrate this deeply spiritual experience into my worldview. This led to a period of intense exploration and study. I voraciously read about different religious and spiritual traditions, philosophy, quantum physics, and neuroscience. Each new piece of knowledge seemed to open more questions than answers. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed by the vastness of the unknown, by the enormity of the questions my experience had opened. A particularly difficult challenge was dealing with people's expectations after I had shared my story. Some saw me as a kind of guru or saint, expecting me to have all the answers to life's great questions. Others expected me to be perpetually serene and happy, incapable of experiencing negative emotions or conflicts. The truth is that despite my extraordinary experience, I was still human, with all the complexities and imperfections that entails. I still had bad days, still made mistakes, still struggled with my own limitations. Learning to accept and embrace my humanity, even while carrying the memory of this transcendental experience, was one of the greatest challenges I faced. Perhaps the deepest and most continuous challenge was living according to the truths I had learned during my experience. Knowing intellectually that we are all one, that love is the fundamental force of the universe, is one thing. Living that truth day to day, in the face of conflicts, injustices, and the harsh realities of the world, is something entirely different. There were times when I felt like a hypocrite, unable to live up to the vision I had been given. How could I talk about unconditional love when I sometimes struggled to forgive someone who had hurt me? How could I talk about the illusion of the ego when I still found myself caught in selfish thought patterns? However, over time, I learned to see these challenges and doubts not as obstacles, but as an integral part of my journey. I came to understand that life on earth is not about reaching a state of spiritual perfection, but about the continuous process of growth and learning. I realized that my doubts, far from invalidating my experience, actually made it more real and meaningful. They kept me humble, open to new perspectives, and in constant pursuit of deeper understanding. And so, I continued my journey, embracing both the certainties and the doubts, the moments of transcendental clarity and the periods of earthly confusion. I learned to see each challenge as an opportunity for growth, each doubt as an invitation for deeper exploration. In the end, I understood that true wisdom does not lie in having all the answers, but in remaining open to the questions, and that true spirituality is not about escaping the complexities of human life, but about diving into them fully, with compassion, curiosity, and love. As I sit here years after that fateful day at Lake Tahoe, I can't help but marvel at the incredible journey my life has become. The near-death experience I lived through was not just an isolated event, but a catalyst that continues to shape my life in ways I could never have imagined. Looking back, I see how every aspect of my life was touched and transformed by that brief yet profound experience. My relationships deepened, my understanding of the world expanded, and my sense of purpose crystallized in a way I never thought possible. One of the most lasting lessons I learned is the reality of unconditional love. Experiencing that love, being completely seen, accepted, and loved exactly as I am, fundamentally changed the way I relate to myself and to others. I realized that this love isn't something to be sought externally, but a fundamental truth to be recognized and expressed in our daily lives. This understanding brought a profound shift in how I see and treat the people around me. Where once I might have judged or criticized, now I seek to understand and accept. Where I used to see differences and separation, I now see connections and unity. Not that I've become a saint, far from it. I still have my moments of impatience, judgment, and selfishness. But now I have an internal compass, a constant reminder of what is truly important. Another significant change was my relationship with fear, especially the fear of death. Having experienced the continuity of consciousness beyond the physical body, death has lost its power to terrify me. This doesn't mean I seek death or don't value life. On the contrary, this experience has made me appreciate even more deeply the precious gift of being alive. But now I see death not as a terrible end, but as a transition, a passage into another form of existence. This release from the fear of death has had a profound effect on how I live my life. I feel freer to take risks, to follow my heart, to live authentically. After all, if there's truly nothing to fear, why not live fully? My understanding of the nature of reality has also been radically altered. The experience of being outside my body, of perceiving realities beyond the physical, made me question many of the assumptions we have about the nature of the universe and our existence. I began to see the material world not as the totality of reality, but as just one layer of a much vaster and more complex existence. This led to a deep interest in the intersection between spirituality and science. I've been fascinated by the discoveries of quantum physics, which seem to echo in surprising ways some of the truths I experienced. The idea that everything is interconnected, that consciousness plays a fundamental role in creating reality. These are no longer just abstract theories to me, but truths that I've felt and lived. Looking to the future, I feel a mixture of excitement and reverence. Excitement for the possibilities I see unfolding, not just in my own life, but in the collective evolution of human consciousness. Reverence for the vastness of the mystery we are immersed in, for the incredible journey it is to be human. I see my future role not as someone who has all the answers, but as a facilitator of important conversations. I want to continue sharing my story, not to convince anyone of a specific truth, but to create spaces where people can explore their own existential questions, their own intuitions about the nature of reality. I dream of a world where we can openly talk about our spiritual experiences without fear of ridicule or disbelief. A world where science and spirituality are not seen as opposites, but as different paths to understanding the same fundamental reality. At the same time, I am deeply committed to translating the truths I've learned into practical action in the world. The unconditional love I experienced cannot remain just a beautiful theory or a distant memory. It must manifest in how we treat one another, how we care for our planet, and how we structure our societies. I see a future where our understanding of the interconnectedness of all things leads us to create more just and sustainable economic and social systems, where our expanded consciousness allows us to resolve conflicts in more compassionate and creative ways, where our sense of unity with all life inspires us to be better stewards of our planet. Of course, I know these are ambitious, perhaps even utopian, goals, but my experience taught me that reality is far vaster and more full of possibilities than we usually imagine. Who am I to limit what is possible? On a personal level, My focus for the future is to continue my own journey of growth and integration. I know I still have much to learn, much to understand. Every day brings new opportunities to deepen my understanding, to live more fully the truths I've learned. I'm committed to continuing to share my story, but also to staying open to the stories of others. Every person I talk to, every book I read, every new experience I have adds another piece to the grand puzzle of existence that I'm trying to piece together. Above all, I'm committed to remaining open to the mystery. My near-death experience showed me that there is far more to reality than we can comprehend with our finite minds. So while I continue to seek understanding, I also cultivate a deep reverence for the unknown, for the ineffable. As I look to the future, I feel profound gratitude for the life that was given back to me, for the vision that was granted to me, for the incredible people I've met on my journey. I feel honored to have had this experience and the opportunity to share it with others. And so, I continue my journey, always mindful that every moment is precious, every interaction is sacred, every challenge is an opportunity for growth. I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I know that I will face whatever comes with an open heart, a curious mind, and a soul deeply grateful for the incredible adventure of being alive. If you enjoyed this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment with your impressions, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell to watch each new video and help us spread this message to more people. Until next time.